Canine German Shepherds found a forest ranger chained to a tree. What they did next will make you cry. The sky was a dull gray sheet above the northern Montana wilderness, the kind that promised snow but offered no clarity. Pines rose like frozen sentinels, thick with frost and silence. The only movement came from paws pressing into the snow, 15 of them, sharp and precise, moving in fluid formation. Max led the way, his breath rising in bursts, tail low, ears twitching. Behind him, the rest of the canine unit kept tight formation, responding not to shouts but to the invisible rhythm of training drilled into bone. Emily walked a short distance behind them, clipboard in hand, eyes on every angle. She had led hundreds of drills, trained dozens of them, but this pack was special, especially Max. He wasn't just a lead dog, he was legacy. Max had been trained by Ranger Daniels, her late mentor and friend, a man whose name still hung in silence at the training center like a photo no one dared to take down. Daniels had vanished 4 days ago on a solo recon mission to investigate illegal poaching deeper in the protected zone. No distress signal, no call, just gone. And today's training route skirted the last known area he had patrolled. Though Emily hadn't told the others, some places didn't need words. Snow crunched beneath her boots. The radios remained quiet. Everything was as expected until it wasn't. Max stopped. No command, no external trigger. His body stiffened, one paw hovering above the ground, head tilted toward the right where a dense thicket of trees stood like a wall. A low growl vibrated from his throat, and then, without warning, he veered off trail. One by one the others followed, no hesitation, no confusion. A military-trained pack abandoning protocol without instruction was unheard of. Max echoed Dakota. Emily barked names like lifelines, her voice cutting through the stillness. But they didn't even flinch. The snow swallowed their silhouettes as they disappeared into the timber, like ghosts chasing something unseen. Emily froze for a second, hand hovering over her radio. Protocol said she should call them back and return to base. But her gut twisted. Something was wrong. She broke into a sprint. The wind pushed against her, branches clawed at her coat, and then there was a flash of movement. Max's shape darted ahead, pausing just long enough for her to glimpse his face focused. Urgent. Emily ran harder. That's when she saw the hat. It lay beside a tree trunk, half buried in snow, its orange band faded but unmistakable. Daniel's ranger hat. Her breath hitched. 10 feet further, drops of blood on the snow, thin and congealed, leading into a narrow path where the snow was freshly disturbed. A sudden flapping caught her attention, a forest hawk, one wing dragging, struggling to lift itself from the ground. Nature was screaming in whispers. Emily pressed forward, slipping once, catching herself on a low branch. The temperature seemed to drop the deeper she went, and the quiet became something heavier, like she was walking into memory. After what felt like 20 minutes, she stumbled into a clearing. She stopped. Her throat closed. The 15 dogs had formed a perfect circle around a massive tree. In its center, propped against the bark like a discarded doll, was Ranger Daniels. His face was gray, lips blue, eyes barely open. Duct tape still gagged his mouth. Nylon rope cinched his arms and legs in cruel knots. Max lay pressed against him, body curled to provide warmth. The others stood like statues, alert and still, their eyes not on Emily but on the silent man between them. She dropped to her knees. Daniels, Daniels, can you hear me? She ripped the tape from his mouth, fumbled at the knots. His body was light, too light, and cold seeped into her hands through his uniform. But he was breathing, weak, barely, but alive. Her radio crackled. Command, this is Handler Echo 1. I need immediate medical evac. I've located Ranger Daniels. He's alive. I repeat, he's alive. She didn't let go of him, not even when the dogs relaxed, not even when the first thump of helicopter blades stirred the treetops. The hours that followed blurred. Medics lifted Daniels into a stretcher, the dogs forming a silent procession behind. Max refused to leave his sheen and was finally allowed into the aircraft. Emily rode with them, eyes never leaving the man she thought was gone. Back at base, after hours of silence and adrenaline detoxing from her veins, she learned what Daniels had endured. He'd been captured by poachers while investigating illegal snares. They beat him, stripped his gear, left him to die tied to that tree. But what broke Emily most was what Daniels confessed in a cracked whisper. I saw my father, in the trees, like when I was a boy, thought I was going to him. But then Max came. Daniel's father had disappeared in those woods decades ago, The memory had haunted him, defined his career, and now nearly gone himself. It was Max's old trainee who pulled him back. The investigation that followed confirmed more than just cruelty. Traps littered the area. One had blood that matched endangered elk DNA. GPS interference equipment was found buried near the site, scrambling his distress signal. And Daniel's final field report, written just before he vanished, named a suspect, a former ranger dishonorably discharged for poaching. That name, the last thing Daniels whispered before losing consciousness, triggered the arrest of an entire poaching ring that spanned 2 states and several border towns. The news spread fast, and the dog's 15 loyal hearts became legends. At a ceremony held weeks later, the town gathered to watch medals draped over each furry neck. Children reached out to pet their heroes. Elderly veterans saluted. Daniels, now walking with a cane, knelt beside Max, tears on his cheeks. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. One look into Max's eyes said enough. The local school was renamed the K915 Academy. Its motto, loyalty saves lives. A little girl who had lost her father in a forest fire stood during the ceremony, clutching her mother's hand, and declared to a reporter, "One day, I'll train dogs like Max." Months passed, life returned to rhythm. But for Daniels, something remained unfinished. One early morning, he and Max returned to that same patch of forest. Snow coated the trees. Silence hung again, but this time it felt sacred. Max paused beneath the tree where Daniels had nearly died, ears flicking toward the canopy above. Daniels watched him, then whispered, "Thank you for not forgetting me." Max moved closer, pressed his head gently into Daniel's leg. In that instant, no forest was empty, no silence was lonely. The bond they shared wasn't forged in training. It was reborn in survival, in memory, an instinct that defied logic and leapt across time like a pulse echoing in the wild. And somewhere beyond the tree line, wind rustled branches as if the forest itself had exhaled. The sun barely cracked through the dense canopy above as the town woke up to its first snowfall since the rescue. At the edge of the pine-shrouded training facility, frost glazed the wooden fence, and the kennel yard shimmered with ice that cracked softly beneath padded paws. Inside the observation room, Emily watched the monitors, each screen displaying a different corner of the grounds. 15 camera feeds, 15 canine units, and yet her eyes kept returning to one Max. He sat still beside his food bowl, untouched since morning, ears flicking, but his eyes fixed on the gate. The others had long resumed routine. Training, feeding, social bonding they adapted as dogs do. But Max, the leader, the rescuer, hadn't barked once since they brought Daniels home. He didn't run. He didn't chase. He waited. Emily walked down the concrete corridor and entered his enclosure. He looked at her with that same silent steadiness. But something was different. His energy was coiled, not tense, restrained. She crouched beside him, running her hand gently along the back of his neck. "You're still listening for him, aren't you?" she whispered. The door creaked behind her. It was the new intern, a college student named Leo with a mop of blonde hair and oversized boots. "Ma'am, Commander Reyes just called. They want a behavioral analysis report on all canines involved in the rescue. Statewide press request." Emily nodded. "Write this down," she said quietly. "Subject Max, status alert, behavior silent, interpretation waiting." Leo blinked, waiting for what Emily rose, brushing snow from her knees. "That's what we're going to find out." Later that day, Daniels visited the facility. Though walking still made him wince, he refused help and leaned heavily on a hand-carved cane that looked almost ceremonial. The dogs greeted him with barks and bouncing tails, crowding around the gate like children seeing their father return from war. All except Max. Max stood at a distance, watching. Daniels noticed, still the serious one. He murmured, a weak smile playing on his face. Emily stepped beside him. "He hasn't barked once, not even when the sirens test. It's like he's preserving something." Daniels didn't answer. His eyes followed Max, who turned away and trotted into the corner where a half-buried piece of rope, the same kind he'd been bound with, lay beneath a thin layer of snow. Max lay beside it, resting his head on the frozen knot. "I think he remembers more than he should," Daniels finally said. "He was there longer than anyone else. With me. Watching. Listening. Maybe he's not waiting for me. Maybe he's guarding what happened." That night, Emily couldn't sleep. She sat in her office surrounded by audio files and field notes. Max's unit logs, footage from the rescue, and a faded photograph Daniels and Max from years ago, when the dog was barely out of puppyhood. paw resting proudly on a training cone. Her mind wandered back to Daniel's rescue, to the signs the ranger had, the bird, the blood drops. They had seemed random at the time, but the more she thought about it, the more it felt orchestrated, or at least intentional, like the forest had left them, or something else had. She opened the GPS logs from that day. Max's path had been erratic on the map, but not in person. His detour had purpose. Angles, pauses. She zoomed in on a cluster of overlapping pings. That's when she saw it. A short pause, 12 minutes exactly 1 mile before they reached Daniels. Max had stopped there, and so had two other dogs. They didn't move, didn't bark, just stood. Why? The next morning, Emily asked Leo to help her gear up. They followed Max's GPS trail from that day through the same snow-bitten woods. The trees groaned in the wind, heavy with ice. After an hour of trudging through the cold, they reached the coordinates. It was a small hollow near a dry creek bed. Nothing out of place, nothing unusual, except for the silence. This is where Max stopped, Emily said, her breath fogging in the air, and waited. Leo glanced around. It's kind of creepy, like the sound's been sucked out of this place. Emily nodded. Dogs know things we don't, and they feel things we ignore. She stepped into the hollow and crouched near a patch of broken twigs. Something caught her eye, metal glinting just beneath the leaves, a fragment of wire, the kind used in snare traps. She pulled on it gently. It stretched deeper into the earth, dug in, hidden. He found another trap, she murmured, and didn't want to leave it unmarked. Emily marked the location and took photos. Back at the station, rangers investigated the site. They uncovered not just one, but a cluster of hidden traps buried deep, some fresh, some years old. It had been a kill zone. The presence of active traps violated the protective buffer zone laws, leading to an emergency crackdown and several anonymous tips. One tip pointed to a cabin miles away, near the old ridge line, long abandoned supposedly. Emily joined the raid team that followed. The cabin was rotten, half collapsed, but inside were crates, old military-grade signal jammers, and a wall covered in wildlife photographs, some of animals tagged for conservation, marked with red X's. Among them was a photo of Max, taped to the bottom corner. Alpha, dangerous. Avoid. Her blood turned cold. They had known the dogs, feared them, marked them, and still, Max had gone in, had led the charge, had sat beside Daniels in silence, not just loyal but aware. After the bust, Daniels returned again. He knelt beside Max's run and reached into his coat. From the inside pocket, he pulled something wrapped in a cloth, the brass badge of his father. Recovered years ago but never worn since. He clipped it gently to Max's collar. For you, he whispered, for saving more than me. Max leaned into him, finally making a soft sound, not a bark, not a growl, but something low, deep, like a breath remembered. That night, Daniels joined Emily by the fire pit behind the facility, watching the snow fall through the beams of the floodlights. He's not just Daniels said after a long silence. He's the part of me that didn't give up, that remembered what I'd forgotten, that waited, even when I thought it was over. Emily nodded slowly. Maybe that's what all of them are, guardians of what we forget, until we're ready to remember. And far in the distance, as the wind rolled over the hills, a single, sharp bark echoed through the trees. Max, breaking his silence not in fear, not in warning, but in triumph. A signal, perhaps, that something had ended, or just begun. The frost was thicker now, days deep into December, and every surface of the forest seemed glazed with silence. It had been 2 weeks since the discovery of the trap site, 2 weeks since Max finally barked again, and yet Emily couldn't shake the weight sitting behind her ribcage. Not dread. Exactly, something heavier than that, like anticipation wearing the mask of calm. The facility had grown quieter, not because the dogs were any less active, but because the humans were starting to listen. Emily, especially. She had begun documenting not just behavior, but patterns, how the dogs moved, which sections of the perimeter they paused at, where their attention lingered. Max, in particular, had developed a habit of rising exactly at 3:17 a.m., walking slowly to the north edge of the yard, and sitting motionless, eyes fixed on the forest, not west, not south, always north. That's where they took him from, Daniel said when she mentioned it to him. The ridge above the creek. He's looking at the origin, not the rescue. Emily wasn't sure if that made her feel better or worse. The town had fallen into its own rhythm since the story broke. Local kids wore hats with canine paw prints embroidered into them. Elderly women knitted blankets with 15 strong across the hem. A mural was painted along the side of the town's post office, each of the dogs captured mid-stride, charging towards something just beyond the frame. But beneath the celebration was something more serious, something quietly unnerving. The investigation had revealed more than anyone wanted to believe. The poachers hadn't just been setting snares for game, they'd been targeting tagged animals tracked by the Conservation Bureau. That required inside knowledge, codes, locations, GPS access. Someone had been feeding them data. Someone on the inside. Daniels had said little since the first raid. He spent most of his time either with Max or hiking the trails again, as if trying to remember the steps that led him to the tree. But Emily knew something haunted him, something he hadn't said. She felt it in the way his eyes stayed too long on certain names during the investigation. One afternoon, Emily was reviewing a box of files when she found a crumpled map. It was stuffed between old gear logs and bore the initials JD in faded marker. It showed the territory north of the ridge, but more than that, it had notes along the margins. Old bunker here, unmarked trail behind the dry creek. Stay off camera grid. Daniels had written this, but why had he hidden it? She found him later that evening by the east fence, watching Max nudge snow from a buried tennis ball. She held up the map. You didn't submit this. Daniels didn't look surprised. He took it from her hands, smoothed it across the top rail of the fence. I was going to. Then I wasn't sure who'd see it. Emily frowned. You think there's someone still out there, someone in uniform? Daniels nodded slowly. This map was drawn before I went out there the last time, but I only showed it to one person, someone I trusted. And they told me to drop it, said the bunker was probably just a storage ruin from the fire of '92, but something about how quickly they dismissed it. It felt rehearsed. Emily studied the terrain on the map. The trail behind the dry creek wasn't on any GPS they used. We go at first light, she asked. Daniels looked at Max, who had stopped playing and was now sitting, watching them. We won't have to wake him. He already knows. At dawn, they set out Emily, Daniels, Leo, and Max, with two other dogs in tow, Rook and Hera, both trained in terrain scouting. The snow crunched like glass beneath their boots. The forest was unnaturally still. No birds, no rustle of deer in the brush. Just the breath of the team and the soft thud of paws ahead. Max took point. They followed the dry creek bed until they reached the bend where the map had marked a deviation. There, behind a fallen spruce and obscured by decades of pine needles and earth, was a narrow break in the hillside, a path, just wide enough for a man to crawl. Hera barked once, low and sharp. Rook stiffened. Tail down, Emily and Daniels exchanged a look. Flashlights on, weapons holstered but unstrapped. They entered. The tunnel sloped down sharply and then leveled. The air grew cold, sharp with iron and mildew. Every footstep echoed at the end of the passage. The path opened into a chamber, stone walls braced with rusted beams, shelves lined with old survival gear, ammunition, crates labeled with faded military stencils. But the centerpiece was what made Emily gasp. A board, tacked with photos, satellite maps, printouts of ranger schedules, a full month of canine movement logs. They were watching us, Leo whispered. All of us. Daniel stepped forward. His eyes were locked on one photo, a group shot from 3 years ago, taken at the annual Ranger Summit. On it, Daniels, Emily, Commander Reyes, and someone circled in red. Connor. Daniel's voice was raw. He was the one I gave the map to. Emily felt a rush of heat despite the cold. That bastard. We don't tell anyone yet, Daniel said. Not until we know how deep this goes. Just then, Max growled, deep, low, not at the wall, not at the board, but at the dark behind them. The tunnel, footsteps, someone else had followed them. Without speaking, they killed their flashlights and pressed back into the walls. Max flattened. Rook and Hera copied him perfectly. Emily drew her sidearm. The steps got closer. Not hurried, confident. Then they stopped. A beam of light from a different flashlight swept into the chamber and then froze. A voice, calm, familiar. You weren't supposed to come here, it said. Daniel's breath caught. Connor. The man stepped into view, his gun drawn, aimed low. This was never supposed to be personal. Joe, you made it that way. Emily moved to raise her weapon, but Max growled louder. He's not alone, she said under her breath. He's stalling. And then chaos. A second man appeared behind Connor, then another from a side alcove. 3 in total, all armed. Rook lunged first, striking the nearest man low. Hera followed. Emily fired once. Daniels dove. Max barreled forward with a roar that didn't sound like a bark. It sounded like fury. What followed was a blur of snarls, gunfire, shouting, and dust. When it cleared, two of the assailants were down. Connor had fled back down the tunnel. Daniels gave chase. Emily tried to follow, but Max leaped past her, faster than all of them, down the winding dark. Daniels ran with a limp but fury in his bones. He caught sight of Connor's shadow turning a corner. Then a scream. Cut off. When they reached the exit, Connor lay on the ground, breathing hard, pinned beneath Max's weight. His gun was a foot away, untouched. Max stood over him, chest heaving, blood on his snout, not his own. Daniel stood over the man who had nearly gotten him killed, nearly silenced the truth. "It's over," Daniel said, but his voice was calm, empty, like a man whose ghost had just begun to rest. And Max stepped away, not triumphant, but watchful, as if guarding not just Daniels but the truth they'd just pulled from the earth, as if he knew the frost hadn't finished melting yet. The weeks that followed the tunnel confrontation unraveled like snowflakes on an open palm brief. Quiet, and with a stillness that felt too deliberate. Connor had been taken into custody without resistance. His confession thin, but damning enough. The bunker, once just myth among the older rangers, was now cordoned off with thick yellow tape and under round-the-clock surveillance. The media caught wind of it quickly. Local headlines labeled Connor a traitor, a double-faced ranger turned poacher collaborator, and townspeople shook their heads as they passed by laminated photos of him once mounted with pride on the ranger station's hallway wall. But beneath the exposure, something deeper lingered, a silence not of justice, but of echo, as if what they uncovered wasn't the end, but the mouth of something older. Emily felt it each time she passed the dog yard. Max had become quiet again, not withdrawn, not tired, just listening. Not to orders, not to people, but to something no one else could hear. Daniels noticed it too. His recovery had stabilized. The cane became more of a companion than a necessity, but he spent less time speaking, more time walking the frost-covered woods, letting his boots tread paths his father once crossed and he had nearly died on. One evening, Emily found him standing by the oak tree. The oak, the one where they had found him weeks ago, half-frozen, bound, at death's doorstep. He didn't hear her approach. His eyes were up in the canopy, following the slow, twitching movement of a single branch in windless air. "You keep coming back here," Emily said softly. Why Daniels didn't look at her? "Because I need to hear it. Hear what it said to Max." Emily hesitated. "You think the forest talked to him?" Daniels finally looked at her then, and his eyes weren't mocking. They were calm. Something did. He saw something here, heard something. Maybe not in words, maybe not in thought, but Max knew. Before we did, before I did. He knelt slowly and brushed away snow at the base of the tree. The rope marks were gone. Nature had erased the violence, but something still lingered. "You think it's over?" she asked. Daniel shook his head. "No, I think we just learned the language." Later that night, as Emily sat reviewing new training footage in her office, Leo burst in, face pale. Phone in hand. "We got a ping," he said breathlessly. "What kind of ping?" From one of the K9 tags. "Hera's. She's at the perimeter right now. But her tag shows movement inside Sector 9. Emily's heart jumped. "That's impossible. Sector 9's locked down. We closed that quadrant last week." "Exactly." They rushed to the monitoring room. On the screen, Hera stood at the southern gate, sniffing the air. But her GPS tag, which hadn't malfunctioned once in 3 years, showed rapid movement half a mile inside the off-limits zone. It couldn't be a glitch. They double-checked the timestamps. The GPS trail was perfect, one continuous path. Only Hera hadn't left her post. Then what or who was moving on her frequency? Clone tag, Leo suggested. A copied signal, Emily nodded slowly. Or a dog. That's not supposed to be here. The thought landed like a weight in the room. There had been rumors, always whispers. Old rangers who spoke of ghost dogs units lost in the fire of '92 that were never recovered. Their trackers fried, their bodies never found. One of them, it was said, had the same profile as Hera, same training, same movements. Some thought it was legend. Daniels never did. And now they had movement. She called him immediately. He arrived within 20 minutes, fully suited, Max at his side. Emily briefed him, her voice low. The signature matches Hera's, but it's not her. The path it's moving through. It's the same line marked on your old map. Daniels looked at Max, who was already pacing by the door, tail stiff, ears fully upright. He knows, Daniels whispered. He already knows. They set out with a small team, just four, all vetted, all quiet. Sector 9 was a no-go for most of the year due to unstable terrain and outdated satellite coverage. But they weren't using tech to find their way now. They were using Max. He led with quiet authority. Nose low, muscles taut. They crossed the old ridge and descended into the hollow basin where light barely reached. The air was colder here, heavier, and as they walked, even the crunch of snow beneath their feet seemed dampened, as if swallowed by the land. After nearly an hour, Max stopped. He growled, not in warning, but as if announcing something. They turned the corner, and there it was, a clearing. In the center, an old kennel structure, collapsed and weather-beaten, half covered in moss and ice, a place lost to paperwork. Emily approached slowly. Beneath one broken beam was a pile of discarded collars, some tagged, some shredded. One had a half-burned tag barely legible. Daniels picked it up, brushed away the grime. This was Bravo, he whispered. One of the K9s from 92. They searched the area in silence. No traps, no tech, just ruins. But the GPS signal was still active, still moving. It led them toward a second structure, an underground hatch, rusted shut. It took Leo and another ranger nearly 15 minutes to pry it open. What waited below wasn't machinery or weapons. It was a holding area, kennel cages, old, rusted, some had claw marks, and on the far wall, scrawled in faded red, "They remember." That's when the GPS signal vanished. Flatline. Gone. Emily stood frozen. Someone or something wanted us to find this. But only now. Daniels walked slowly to the center of the chamber. Max at his side. This wasn't just a place, he said. It was a promise. Someone was training dogs out here. Off record. Maybe for combat. Maybe for something worse. Why tag them with real canine identities, Leo asked. To mask them. To blend them. Use our own system to hide theirs. Emily felt the back of her neck prickle. Connor was just a piece of it. There's still more. Someone who knew about this, who covered it, and then Max barked once, sharp, cutting through the cold like a knife. From the far wall, behind a loose panel, came a noise, a shuffle, a breath. They raised their lights. A single figure sat curled in the corner, covered in dirt, wrapped in a ragged ranger coat. His beard was wild, face bruised, eyes wide with shock. Is that? Leo whispered. That's my God, that's Ranger Hill. He went missing in 2008. Emily stepped forward slowly, hands raised. Ranger Hill, can you hear me? The man blinked, his voice cracked and barely human. They kept us. They trained the ones that didn't forget. Max moved forward and sat beside the man. Not barking, not growling, just watching. Hill looked at him, tears filling his eyes. They said you were the last, but you came back. Emily's voice was trembling now. What happened here? Hill whispered a single phrase. Not all the ghosts were dogs. The moment the words left Ranger Hill's lips, not all the ghost eyes were dogs. The air inside that rusted underground room changed. It wasn't colder, but it felt heavier, as though the weight of the past had finally materialized in the same space they now occupied. Emily stood frozen, eyes locked on the man in the corner, whose very existence defied over a decade of paperwork. Searches, obituaries. Hill's presence wasn't just a shock. It was a seismic shift. Daniel stepped forward, slowly, crouching beside Max, who remained still, his gaze locked onto Hill's with something that looked almost human recognition. Perhaps, or shared memory. You were listed as presumed dead, Daniel said, voice hushed as if trying not to break the moment. You disappeared in '08. We found your boots near the southern ravine. Hill's head twitched slightly, not quite a nod. They let me leave them there, make it look like I panicked. They needed one less name on the grid. Emily lowered her weapon, heart pounding in her ears. Who is they? Hill. The man gave a broken chuckle that quickly dissolved into a wheezing cough. The ghosts, he rasped. The ones wearing our uniforms, smiling like brothers. We thought we were training dogs for recovery, for tracking. But some of those dogs, those weren't rescues. They were bred, conditioned, broken and rebuilt in those cages. He looked around the room with wild eyes, as if seeing layers beneath the rust. Not all of them made it. The ones that did, They didn't come back normal. Daniel swallowed hard. You saw them? Hill nodded. I saw them after. Saw what they became when they were let loose during drills. Not just animals, more like weapons, like someone had figured out how to erase their fear. Emily's voice came out as a whisper. But why hide them? Why hide you? Because I found out the wrong day, Hill said, gripping the collar of his tattered coat. Heard things over the comms I wasn't supposed to. They brought me here, told me it was for reprogramming. But I didn't break. Max suddenly stood, moving closer to the man. He sniffed the ragged clothing, then sat down directly in front of Hill and did something none of them expected. He placed his paw gently on Hill's knee. The man stared, eyes brimming. You were one of them, he said to Max. But you remembered who you were, Daniels whispered. He wasn't bred for war. He was raised for loyalty. That's what saved me. Emily knelt beside the group, flashlight sweeping across the holding cages once more. Then who else remembers, she asked, and how many more were left behind? They didn't get the answer, not immediately, because at that moment, the comms on Emily's shoulder crackled violently. Handler Echo 1. This is base, you need to return. Now it's Hera, Emily froze. What about her? She's gone. From the kennel. No sign of forced entry. And she's not alone. Emily stood in one motion. How many static buzzed? Then the ranger's voice returned. Brittle. All of them. Every dog from Unit Bravo 4. All 6. Their trackers have been disabled. Same method as the bunker tags. Daniel's face went pale. Those dogs were all retired, decommissioned, old injuries. Most were already placed in homes. Not anymore. The voice replied, they're moving. South, direct line toward the town. They were already running, flashlights cutting through the tunnel as Max led the charge back to the surface. Behind them, Leo helped Ranger Hill to his feet, and despite his condition, the man moved with urgency, muttering, they'll come in pairs, trained that way, one for the scent, one for the kill. When they reached the vehicles, Max leapt into the lead truck without waiting for command. Emily took the wheel. Daniels beside her. Radio lit with updates, dogs spotted along the tree line near Old Ridge Road. Strange howling reported by campers 2 miles east. A civilian's dog torn from its leash and never found. But it wasn't just chaos. It was coordinated, calculated. Daniels stared at the map, fingers tapping. They're pushing us, he muttered. They want to draw us in. To where, Emily asked. To them. The next transmission cut in sharp and terrified. Base to all units, interference on cameras. Compound south perimeter down. Canine enclosures have been breached. One of the rangers is missing, looks like Leo. Last seen heading to check generator backup. Emily slammed the brakes. Max jumped out before the wheels stopped turning. He's going back, Daniel said grimly. To the tree. What tree? Hill's voice came from the back seat. The one they left me to die on, Daniel said. Max isn't running away. He's trying to finish it. They followed him on foot through dark so thick it felt like molasses. No wind, no stars, just crunching snow and heavy breathing. Max never stopped. Even when distant growls echoed from the North Ridge, he turned only once, waiting for Daniels to catch up. You know where, Daniels whispered. Max moved again. When they reached the clearing, the one that had been both tomb and cradle, the scene was unlike anything they could have imagined. 6 dogs circled the tree, each wearing shredded remnants of service harnesses. Their eyes glowed unnaturally in the low light. They weren't frothing, they weren't angry. They were waiting. At the base of the tree, Leo knelt, eyes wide, breath frozen in a scream that wouldn't come out. One of the dogs stood behind him, not attacking, just watching. Daniel stepped forward, slow and calm. These were ours, he said aloud, but someone rewrote them. One of the dogs growled. Max moved to Daniel's side, not threatening, not tense present. Then he barked, not a warning, a command. One bark, then silence. 2 of the circling dogs stopped moving, tilted their heads. Max barked again, short, sharp. The cadence of training. Emily stepped beside them, hands low, palms out. What if he can reach them, she said. What if he remembers for them? Daniels knelt beside Max and whispered a string of phrases. Old command codes, long retired. Max repeated them in motion, step forward. Sit, paw up, bark, again, again. On the 3rd repetition, one of the rogue dogs sat, then another. The others twitched, confused. The one behind Leo shifted weight, head tilted, and then Leo screamed. The dog lunged. but not at him, past him, into the trees, and then silence. Max had run after it. The clearing emptied in less than 5 seconds. All 6 dogs scattered like smoke, but they hadn't attacked. Not once. Only watched. Only waited. Daniels found Leo, shaking, crying, still in one piece. "They didn't hurt me," he whispered. "Why didn't they hurt me?" Emily's voice was distant, because Max was here. The next morning was still. The sun broke through for the first time in days, casting long beams through the forest canopy. They never found the 6 dogs again. But strange sightings trickled in from nearby towns, a dog helping a hiker lost in the gorge, another pulling a child from a frozen lake, a third sitting silently outside a burned ranger cabin where no living animal should have survived. The file remained open, but unofficially, they called it closed. Ranger Hill was transferred to a facility for recovery. His presence shook the department, but ignited reforms across the region. Max returned to his yard, to his food bowl, to the silence he chose. Emily visited daily. Daniels did too, until the day Max walked up to the tree by himself and never came back. They searched for weeks, left his favorite toy at the base. But Daniels understood. He went to finish his watch. He told Emily one evening, "Some guardians don't stay forever, just long enough to show us how to see again." And Sovaru, at the edge of the forest where trees remember more than men. The story ended not with a gunshot or a headline, but with paw prints vanishing into snow. And the knowledge that somewhere out there, a loyal heart still listens for the ones who forget and chooses to remember.